monastery's silence was broken only by the soft whisper of the wind rustling through the bamboo leaves. Seated in the stone courtyard, worn smooth by time, Ethan watched the small flame flickering before him. It was just a simple candle, yet it seemed to carry within it the same fire that burned in his heart. He had traveled long roads, crossed bustling cities, and left behind a comfortable life in search of something he couldn't quite name. The restlessness that had followed him since his youth had led him here, to a secluded temple nestled in the mountains where monks dedicated their lives to silence and the pursuit of understanding the universe. But would he find the answers he longed for? Or, as had happened so many times before, would his restless mind once again pull him away from true understanding? As he took a deep breath, trying to absorb the serenity of this place, an elderly monk approached and sat beside him. No words were exchanged. Only the sound of their breathing and the gentle breeze filled the space between them. Ethan felt the weight of his own silence and suddenly realized something he had never considered before. Perhaps the answers he sought were not in asking more questions, but in the space between them. He was about to learn that when a heart calls out for something, the universe responds, but only those who know how to listen can truly hear it. The next morning, Ethan was summoned by Thomas, one of the temple's most respected monks. With a calm, knowing gaze, Thomas handed him a cracked ceramic bowl and said, "Take this to the river and fill it with water." It seemed like a simple task at first, but as Ethan made his way back to the temple, he noticed the water slowly leaking through the cracks. He tried covering them with his fingers, walking faster, but nothing worked. By the time he reached Thomas, the bowl was nearly empty. The monk simply smiled and said, "Just like this bowl, your mind is full of fishes. You seek knowledge, but it slips away through your restlessness. Before you can find answers, you must first learn to be still." Ethan frowned. How could he quiet his mind when so many questions pulsed within him? In the days that followed, Ethan tried to embrace the monk's routine, but frustration quickly set in. He grew impatient during meditation, irritated with simple tasks, and couldn't understand how a day filled with silence and manual labor could lead to enlightenment. One evening, feeling defeated, he sat alone in the garden, convinced he was failing. That was when Lucas, a young monk, approached and said, "You came here expecting answers to arrive like thunder, but the Buddha's teaching is not a lightning bolt. It is the rain that gently soaks the earth." Ethan gazed up at the dark sky and wondered how many times he had rejected learning simply because he was waiting for something grand, overlooking the quiet lessons unfolding all around him. One morning, as Ethan swept the temple grounds, he noticed an old beggar standing at the entrance. The man looked weary and hungry, yet few paid him any attention. Without hesitation, Ethan rushed to the kitchen and returned with a piece of bread and a cup of hot tea. The beggar smiled and said, "You understand more than you realize. The deepest teaching is not in what we hear, but in what we practice." It was only then that Ethan remembered an old story Thomas had once told. A young man once asked the Buddha what the path to enlightenment was, and the Buddha simply smiled and served him a cup of tea. The greatest lessons are not found in words, but in actions. Ethan's journey had led him to an unexpected realization. He didn't need to search for distant answers. He needed to learn how to see what was already before him. His restlessness was like the cracked bowl. The more he tried to hold on to it, the more it slipped away. But when he simply embraced the experience, when he allowed himself to live in the moment, he finally began to understand what it truly meant to listen to a heart that calls out. The silence that had once felt like a burden now became a sacred space where he could perceive the answers that had always been there. That afternoon, as he walked through the temple garden, Ethan paused before a moss-covered stone. He recalled something Thomas had said days earlier. Water never fights against the stone, but over time, it shapes it. For the first time, he grasped the true meaning of those words. All his life, he had tried to control everything, his doubts, his fears, his impatience. But perhaps true wisdom wasn't found in struggle, but in acceptance. The wind rustled the leaves of the trees. The sound of water flowing gently through the stream beside the temple echoed in the silence. and Ethan felt something different. For the first time, his mind was still, not because he had found all the answers, but because he had finally stopped resisting. Later, as he helped Lucas light the temple lanterns, Ethan watched how the light danced softly against the stone walls. Enlightenment was not a distant destination, but a process. He realized that each day, each simple task, each moment of silence carried a lesson. He no longer needed grand revelations. He only needed to be present, absorbing the wisdom that life continuously offered. His heart, once restless and desperate for answers, was now at peace. He had not uncovered a hidden secret or a single absolute truth, but he had discovered something even more powerful. The wisdom had been within him all along. He just needed to learn how to listen. That night, before going to sleep, Ethan sat in the courtyard and closed his eyes. The wind brushed gently against his face, and for the first time in a long while, he felt no need to seek anything beyond the present moment. He thought of the beggar, the cracked bowl, Thomas's silence, and realized that everything was connected. Every challenge, every doubt, every encounter had been part of his transformation. The answer was not a single phrase or a specific lesson, but the sum of everything he had lived through. With a quiet smile, he took a deep breath and felt the weight he had been carrying dissolve. After all, it was never about having all the answers. It was about learning to walk lightly, listening to the whisper of existence with each step. Ethan's journey reminds us that we often search for answers in grand speeches, complex books, or extraordinary experiences, yet we forget that true wisdom reveals itself in the smallest of things, in silence, in patience, in compassion, and in the simplicity of the present moment. Just as he had to stop fighting against his own restlessness to finally understand, we too must learn to trust the flow of life. We may not always receive all the answers right away, but if we allow ourselves to listen with an open heart, we will realize that the universe responds in subtle and profound ways. Perhaps what we seek so desperately is already right in front of us. We just need to learn how to see it. May this story inspire us to live with more presence and awareness, to recognize that every moment carries a lesson, and above all, to remember that a heart that calls out is never ignored. Whether through an unexpected conversation, a small act of kindness, or the simple silence that surrounds us, there is always a path to understanding. Now the question I leave with you is this: what is the universe trying to show you at this very moment? Think about it and continue your journey with wisdom. And if you'd like to reflect even further, I invite you to join us for our next story. Who knows, perhaps the answer you've been searching for is waiting for you there.